God's got a plan. I don't care who you are, where you are, what's going on in your life. The Lord's got a plan this morning. Sometimes it seems like God would never use somebody like me or you. I mean, who are we really? We're just kind of normal folks. And God could do a whole lot better. He could get better educated. He could get more influential folks. He could use whomever he wanted to. He chose people kind of like Moses and kind of like me and you. As we talk about this burning bush experience for a few minutes this morning, I want you to think back. I want you to use your imagination a little bit. Some of you folks as farmers, you've messed with livestock and you know kind of what it is to go out and run up your animals when they get out the fence. You go home from church and your cows is up in the middle of the road and you can't even get to your driveway. You got to get out and gather your animals up before you can even get out the car. You understand dealing with animals. You learn a lot of things. You learn patience. You learn wisdom. You learn how to fix holes in the fence. You learn all kinds of stuff you never thought about before until you start dealing with animals. God said if there's one thing stubborner than animals, it's dealing with people. So here we are. How y'all doing this morning? I don't know about you, but I am real certain that God looks down at me a whole bunch and goes, Chris, what am I going to do with you? I can kind of identify with Moses. I want to share with you a couple of thoughts this morning about God's plan and when God's plan just begins to take place and happen in our life. And the first thing I want to share with you is, out of verse 1, is that God's plan happens to unusual people. That's what it says in verse 1. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Well, we know from this verse that, first of all, Moses messes with animals. He's a shepherd. He deals with sheep. Second of all, he's married. He's got a father-in-law. And his father-in-law is the priest of Midian. How'd you like to marry a girl and her daddy was a priest? You think you had trouble measuring up to your father-in-law? I mean, that's got to be a pretty tall order right there. His cat was probably pretty picky about who dated his daughter. And here comes Moses wandering through the wilderness. By the way, you know how old he is here? He's like 80 years old. 80 years old. How many of y'all's chasing sheep at 80? That just don't happen very often. You know what I mean? See, if you look at Moses, me and you would probably take this type of attitude. We'd probably say something like, God, Moses is the perfect cat for the job. He's been trained in Pharaoh's house by his own daughter. He's been taught the language of the Egyptians, the customs of the Egyptians. He knows how to respect the Pharaoh. He's been there before. He spent 40 years in the wilderness. He's an expert on wilderness travel. He's the perfect man for the job, God. But you notice in this whole chapter 3, God never once pats Moses on the back or talks about how good his accolades are or his qualifications to be a leader. God never once looks at the strengths of Moses. But oftentimes in this chapter, you'll see God referring to his own strength, to his own name, to his own majesty. I'm telling you something, God's plan involves unusual people. Some of y'all probably saying, I'm too old to be used by God. Cat was 80. Come on now. If you ain't over 80, I don't want to hear you fussing, all right? If you're over 80, you got every right in the world to fuss. You go right ahead, all right, because I'm sure you're hurting and you're welcome. You've earned that right. But I want to tell you something, folks. God uses unusual people just like Moses. Not only was Moses a tad bit over the hill, he was also on the lam. He had a murder charge back in Egypt. Y'all remember that story? Where he killed an Egyptian slave master and tried to bury his body in the sand. And when Moses found out that people knew what had happened, he got afraid and he ran for fear of his life. He's been living on the run for 40 years out in the desert. Folks, he's raised up in the palace, but now he's living out in the pasture with the sheep. And God's teaching this old boy some hard lessons about life. I think it would probably no stretch of the imagination to say that Moses had enrolled in the school of hard knocks. Some of y'all's enrolled in that school too. Don't even know it, some of you. But you're going through some tough times, and you wonder sometimes, why does God allow all these problems to happen? Why does God let me go through such hardship and suffering? And I don't understand why the Lord don't work things out. I'm sure Moses probably thought that exact thing many times during those 40 years in the wilderness. Many times as he was leading those stinking, stubborn sheep out into the pastures, he would think, Lord, I had it made down at Pharaoh's house. If I could have just kept my temper in check. If I could have just not hit that fella and killed him. Lord, help me, Jesus. Why did you put me out here in the middle of the wilderness? And God's going, I got to teach you how to live off the land, son. Because you're going to lead my children through very similar terrain. Sometimes God takes us through hard points in our journey so that in the future we can lead others through those same type of places in our life. Moses was an old man. He was a shepherd man, a farmer man. He was also a wanted man. But you know something? Moses was probably a pretty stubborn fellow too. Anybody who at the whim of anger can jump up and get mad enough to kill somebody because he loses his temper has probably got, what we would say, I guess you could say at the very least he's got a backbone. I kind of like men with a backbone. Now, Jens is a little stubborn and hard-headed. I'll give you that. But you know what? I kind of like that type because when the going gets tough, they don't run out on you too often. They're the ones that's willing to stand when the fight gets to going thick and when the blood, the sweat, and the tears gets to flowing. It's those that's got that consternation, those that have that character that endure anything. I'm going to tell you something, folks. I'll take a handful of Christians that got saved in a penitentiary or got pulled out the beer joint. I'll take those kind and gather them around me, and we'll serve God together and give him the praise because they're not afraid to bleed a little bit. They're not afraid to get talked about a little bit. They're not going to run out on you at the first time somebody raises up a little problem or controversy. We need men and women of God that's got the backbone to stand no matter what the circumstances here. But sometimes that'll drive you out in the wilderness, folks. Because God has to knock the hard edges off of us. If you know what I'm talking about, and you got some hard edges on you. I know I do. When God puts me on the potter's wheel and it spins around, I go ka-thumpa, ka-thumpa, ka-thumpa. I'm like one of them shopping cart wheels that's got a hole in it. Ka-thumpa, ka-thumpa. I'm a wobbling around up there, and God's going, man, I got a lot of work to do on that boy. But God's pretty good at doing his work. And if there's hope for a knothead like me, then I'm sure there's hope for you too. See, God's plan happens to unusual people, but it also happens at unusual places. Anybody seen my Bible? Look here in the last part of verse 1. It says, and Moses kept the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, priest of the Midian, and he says this, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. You notice how God's plan sometimes happens at unusual places too. It's not just the unusual people. But why didn't God call Moses when he was living down there in Pharaoh's house? Why didn't God call Moses when he had the finest education, was wearing the brand new tennis shoes that the Egyptians had and all that fine apparel? Why didn't God call him before he had to suffer and go through hardship and he had to be a wanted man like that? I don't know, but you know something? God waited until Moses got into one of the most desolate, most dangerous places of his life before the Lord spoke to his heart. He's on the backside of the desert. And he came to the mountain of God. Moses didn't know much about the mountain of God yet, but he's going to learn a whole lot in these next 40 years about this old mountainside. God's going to bring him back here. As a matter of fact, later on in this same chapter, God says, as proof, Moses says, Lord, I can't go to say to the Israelites, you got to be kidding me, Lord, I can't talk right. I'm nervous. I'm not a leader. I'm a shepherd. I'm a wanted man. He's got every excuse in the world. And God goes, I ain't worried about you. It ain't you that I'm sending, Moses. It's me that does the trick. God sent Moses down to do the impossible, and Moses had every excuse in the world. But when God gets you out on the backside of the desert, ain't nobody there to listen to your excuses. Check this out. As Moses was going, but Lord, I can't talk right. You know what the sheep said? Meh. Because that's all they really say is meh. You thought they was going to talk, didn't you? I ain't going there. In other words, my point is this. The sheep didn't matter. They didn't care if Moses stuttered. They didn't care if he couldn't talk good. They didn't care if he wasn't a good leader. You know what they cared about? He was willing to lay his life down for them when the bear or the lion came up. He was willing to spend the cold nights in the desert with them, no matter how tired and how rough and how bad the weather may be. He was willing to walk with them where nobody else would walk. Can I tell you something today? What God is looking for is not the impressive. It's not the powerful. It's not those that have all the money and the prestige in the world. What God is looking for is somebody who's willing to lay his life down for his brother or sister just the way Jesus did. What God is looking for is somebody that's willing to walk through the deserts with us and take our hand and go through those times where we can't do nothing but cry and our heart hearts are broken. God's looking for people this morning, and He's going to unusual places to find them, kind of like this church right here. Where's God taking you in your journey? I went on my road trip out to Sturgis a few weeks ago. When I got back, my wife, who had encouraged me to go, she comes up with this line. She says, I think it's great for you to go on a road trip. I think it's great for you to take out a motorcycle, but 1 week's long enough. 2 weeks is way too long. She done laid the law down on me. Y'all hear that? She done got legalistic quick. 2 weeks is too long. I said, but honey, I can't get to the backside of the desert in 2 weeks, in 1 week. It takes 2 weeks to get to the other side of the Rockies and get back. She said, well, go to the Smokies. And I'm like, well, you don't understand. Sometimes you got to hurt before God reveals Himself to you. Now, it's not necessarily a requirement. God don't always do it that way. But oftentimes, God gets you in some pretty unusual places to speak to your heart. I'll give you an example. One night, about 12 years ago, I pulled into my campsite outside of Sturgis, and it was in a canyon, about a 2-mile dirt road. It was just totally dark back there, and a buddy of mine had been with me. He just fell out that day and got a U-Haul and shipped him back home to the East Coast. And he just left out, bless his heart. I told him, he said, I'm sick. I said, man, are you kidding me? Lord, if I ever get sick, let it be in Sturgis. That'd be cool. I'll just lay out here for a few months, But no, he wanted to get back here for some reason or other. And he left. And I said, that's cool. Got him packed up, shipped him off. That very night he left, I pulled into my campsite that night. When I shut my motorcycle off and the lights killed down, I saw something I never saw before in my life, and I knew exactly what it was. The Aurora Borealis, the northern lights, had appeared. And it's very rare that they show up in the lower 48. But that night, when I got there, God He showed me many things that night. But one of the things He showed me was when the going gets tough, and when your body begins to reject and fail on you and you're just hurting everywhere you turn, don't give up then, because God's greatest blessings might just be the very next evening. My brother that got tired and hurting and left missed the greatest sight that I'd probably ever seen in the sky. And that night, God showed me many things. Folks, don't you ever give up, no matter how desert the place may be, no matter how far out of God's will you may feel. Just know that God's got a plan for you tonight, and you keep trucking and doing the things that He's called you to do. He'll reveal Himself to you pretty soon. He was at a very unusual place. But you know something? It wasn't the person that made God's plan important. It wasn't the place that made God's plan important. But notice thirdly, there's something else here. God's plan happens with an unusual presence. Look at number 4. And when the Lord saw that, He turned aside. Well, let's go back to 3 and 4. Moses said, I'll now turn aside and see this great sight while the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. You ever heard God call your name? It may be, it just might be that God's burning bushes in your life, trying to get your attention. And you know what we do? We walk past it every day. I got a question here, and nobody can really answer this, I don't think. But how long did that bush burn before Moses went over and looked at it? We think about this. I've always looked at this story, and I think, well, Moses, he walked up, seen a bush, and said, oh, that's kind of cool. A few minutes later, it ain't quit burning. He walked over to it. But this week, as I've been studying this, let me just use your imagination. What if Moses led his sheep out, and sheep would take their time to graze on the hillside? It takes a while. What if Moses led his sheep out, saw the burning bush, laid down that night, went to sleep, got up the next day, bush is still burning? What if it took 2 or 3 days, and every time he walked by that way, the bush is over there burning? What if sometime in your evening, and you walk home tonight, or this afternoon, you go up the driveway to your house, and there's a bush burning in your driveway? You get up tomorrow morning, go to work, the bush is still burning next to your driveway. You come home tomorrow evening, the bush is still burning in your driveway. How long is it going to be for you to go look at that bush? Probably not very long. But I wonder how often God has burnt bushes in our life. Little signs, little things to get our attention, to say, hey, I want you to look at me. How many times did we probably do like Moses and walk right by? Miss the sign that God's trying to get our attention. How many times did God do things in our lives to get? Can I give you a good example? Last Sunday morning, Brother Lloyd, if I may, last Sunday morning, we seen in this church an example. As I was standing up here trying to preach, God said, shh, y'all be quiet. I got something to say. And we gathered around this altar as we shut up to preaching and got to praying. As our brother was laying back there and the ambulance is on the way, God reached down and touched his body and he raised him up. Last Sunday morning in church, we saw a man on his deathbed without much hope of survival. And God heard the prayers of his children and delivered that brother back there. And that's why he's doing the Lord today, amen? Because God touched his heart and blessed him. But I dare say these people walked out this church last Sunday morning and never stopped to see the sign that God was trying to get your attention. What happened when Moses stopped and looked at the bush? He said, I'm going to check out this great thing. Why come the bush ain't burning up? And as soon, the Bible says in verse 4, as soon as God saw Moses looking toward the bush, he called his name. Can I ask you a question? How long has it been since you looked toward God? What does it take for us to look towards God? Grumpy, does it take a near miss on our bike? Sometimes that'll help. That'll encourage you to look towards God. Does it take a report from the doctor saying, we believe it's cancer? Does it take the death of a child? This morning, God's burning a bush up in here. He's trying to get some of our attentions about something. And if you don't listen to the Lord today, then that bush is going to have to burn hotter next week. Brighter. God's trying to get your attention. If you walk away from God's sign today, you may not ever hear his word again. He may never call your name. But if we turn our attention toward the Lord, because, see, it's not about the person, it's not about the place, it's all about the presence of God. You know why we come to church on Sunday morning? Some of y'all come to church just to hear me mess up the choir. It ain't that. That ain't why we're here. Some of y'all just come to see what I'm going to spit and stutter and slobber about and sweat on when I'm preaching. It ain't about the preaching. You know why we come to church? One reason. I want to hear God speak my name. I want to hear the Lord say, this is what I want you to do. There's families in here and there's people and individuals here today that you got decisions coming up this week. Maybe you don't even know what they are yet. But you don't know which way to go. And God is the one that's going to give you the guidance you need. Folks, I'm going to tell you something. Those that wait on the Lord mount up with wings as eagles. Amen? I think that sometimes we don't need to do nothing until we hear God speak our name. Even, oh gosh, this ain't good. Even if it takes us 40 years of waiting. Here's a question I never thought about. Do you reckon that's the first burning bush Moses had ever passed? What if God had been putting burning bushes out there for years? And Moses was walking around saying things like, can't believe I killed that Egyptian dude. Shucks, man, I messed up my whole life. Shoot, got all these stinking sheep. They just walk right by it, complaining about our everyday circumstances and never seeing God trying to get our attention. It happens to me. Sure it happens to you. You know what? Sometimes I get on that motorcycle and I'll get to riding down the road and I'll get to praying and I'll get to thinking about, oh, Lord, help so-and-so. They're on their deathbed. And, oh, God, I get to just praying or fretting about something. And you know something? I will forget to look at the most beautiful sunset that God painted just for me to check out. I know it was just for me. You know why it was just for me? Because if you look at it and you're on the other side of the woodlands, it's going to have a little different look to it. It's going to have a little different angle to it. So the one I'm looking at is just for me. Some of y'all are going to ride home from church this evening. Y'all going to be going home going, that preacher never should have done that. I don't know how to wait to get something to eat. And you're going to forget and see the beautiful clouds that God put up there for you. Some of you tonight will go home and go to bed and lay down without even praying, without even stopping to look at the beautiful stars that God hung. God does little miracles in our lives every day, and many of these miracles are signs like a burning bush to get our attention so that we can look God's way so he can say, Chris. And when God calls your name, how are you going to respond? See, it's not about the unusual people that he calls, and it's not about the unusual places that he calls them. It's all about the unusual presence of God. You know what, church? It can be just church. It can be just another social organization. We come and meet a couple of times a week and hang out and laugh together, or it can be a place of worship. It can be a place that we don't come to see the preacher or the choir. It's a place we come to see the bush burn. And this morning, my prayer is that God is beginning to light a fire in your heart. And I don't know what it is he's trying to tell you, but God's got a mission for you. As a matter of fact, tonight we're going to be talking about on a mission for the master. God's going to reveal to you tonight what your mission is if you care to come back at 6 o'clock. But this morning I want to tell you he's got a calling for you. And before you can find out what your mission is, you've got to first turn and say, yes, Lord, here am I. That's what Moses did. And then in verse 6 it says this. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of of Isaac and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. You know something, in America today, we're not afraid to look towards God. Matter of fact, we're so bold to shake our fist in God's face. We're so bold we use his name in vain. We watch trash on TV that takes God's name in vain left and right, and we ain't got the good sense to get up and cut it off. Some of us ought to have the good sense to grab a pair of scissors and cut the cord in half, amen? But we ain't going to do nothing like that. We need to realize that if we get the trash out and we can listen to God speak a whole lot more. If God said, Moses, it's me. And Moses said, I'm listening, Lord. Our problem today is God's going to speak to somebody this morning in this church right now. He's going to say, I got something to tell you. You know what you're going to do? You're going to go home and cut on a football game and miss what God's got to say. What if God's speaking to somebody's heart this morning and say, I want to spend the evening with you. I want you to walk down through the woods for a little bit. I want to just speak to your heart. And you miss that burning bush, man. And you miss hearing God call your name. I'm going to tell you something, folks. When God calls your name, it's the greatest thing you've ever experienced. Long story short, God says in verse 7, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, which are in Egypt, have heard their cry by the reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians. Folks, I'm thankful that verse tells me that God sees us when we hurt, he hears us when we cry, and he visits us when we need deliverance. This morning in closing, as Sister Lane comes to prepare a hymn of invitation, my invitation is this. Don't you need God to come visit you? Don't you desperately need to hear God speak your name and tell you he's got a plan for your life? This morning, God's got a purpose for everything that you're going through. And as we begin to open up this altar, I'm going to ask you to stand. And if you need to come and pray today, God's speaking to your heart. You come. You get around this old altar. You kneel here. And you just call out to the Lord. If nothing else, you just come and say, Lord, I perceive you. I feel like you're trying to call my name. Here I am, Lord. Here I am. And just listen. And let God speak to your heart. Maybe this afternoon, some of you need to go for a little walk. Walk down by the river. Walk down in the backyard. Just let God speak to your heart.